I got this suit from my grandmother's house. It was originally supposed to be for one of my brothers, but when my grandmother caught me eyeing it, she was like,
oh, I see you eyeing it. I mean, like, I'm sure you could fit in it too if your brothers can't fit in it.
And I wanted to wear it for this video, and I am sorry to my parents' iris plants for mutilating this for my look. But I'm not done with it yet. I kind of like perspectives to give, both as a Christian and transgender talking points. Today I wanted to talk about why I think that Asperger syndrome should still be used as a diagnosis, separate from autism. Now, I don't think it has to be Asperger. It could be something else, because I know Hans Asperger has a lot of controversy surrounding his name that we will get into in the video.
The first disclaimer I want to get out of the way.
I'm not going to be giving a comprehensive report of autism. I'm just going to be giving you some context behind the terms autism and Asperger syndrome. So, Leo Kanner described autism for the first time in 1943 at Johns Hopkins University. Leo Kanner was one of the founders of the psychiatry School of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University.
Leo Kanner was the father of autism, if you will.
In 1944, completely separately, Hans Asperger described a condition of autistic psychopathy in Germany. 1981, Lorna Wing translated Hans Asperger's research from German to English, and that was published in the DSM as Asperger syndrome. And then in 2018, Asperger syndrome was removed from the DSM and replaced with just
Autism spectrum disorder
as a whole. So now there was no longer a distinction between Asperger syndrome and autism. Shortly before that, in 2010, Arthur aired an episode entitled When Carl Met George about a boy with Asperger syndrome. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the first time I, your humble narrator, was exposed to Asperger syndrome. So the second disclaimer I want to get out of the way is that I have never been formally diagnosed with autism or Asperger syndrome. This might come as betrayal to you.
How dare you say in your YouTube about that you're an Asperger?
You've been lying to us the entire time. Well, have you ever heard of self-diagnosis?
Oh my goodness, you're one of those leftist snowflakes who believes that self-diagnosis is valid?
I understand that a lot of people on the left who would be considered snowflakes believe that self-diagnosis is just as valid as a professional diagnosis, and I don't agree with everything on that side of the political spectrum. But I think that self-diagnosis can be valid. Now, we live in a weird time where on social media, any psychiatric personality gender diagnosis is like currency and will get you followers and impression points, which can definitely influence people to falsely diagnose themselves. However, my journey to discovering I had Asperger syndrome is a bit different. I first learned about autism when I was maybe 6 years old because there was a boy at my school
Who I'm now pretty good friends with still to this day.
who had autism. So my mom got this picture book from the library entitled, Autism or something. I read it, I didn't relate to it at all, and it was pretty broad. It basically said stuff like,
People with autism have a hard time making friends.
or it can be hard for people with autism to look you in the eye, or people with autism often like to be left alone.
Slight tangent. There was this girl I was friends with when I was maybe 7 or 8, and even though we were technically friends, I thought she was annoying. And I remember once her family and my family and a different family all went on vacation together at a campsite. And she and I and this other girl were on the top bunk in a cabin, and we were talking. And I looked at her and I said,
I think you have... I forgot the name of the condition.
and then I ran to find my mom, and I asked her,
Hey Mom, what's the name of that condition where you have a hard time making friends sometimes?
and she was like, oh, you mean autism, right? And I was like, yeah, great, thank you. So I run back to the cabin, I climb the top bunk, and I say to her, I think you have autism because people with autism have a hard time making friends. When in actuality, she was probably the least autistic person in the world. See, I found out later that everyone really liked her and she was incredibly charismatic and could make friends very easily. I was just the one who had a problem with her, which probably says a lot more about me.
From an early age, up until the age I was maybe 7 years old, I thought I was the only normal person in the world. Everyone else was too emotional, too immature. They thought things were funny when they weren't really funny. They enjoyed talking about dumb things.
Yeah, like everyone's really weird. Why am I the only normal person?
When I was about 7 years old, though, I realized, wait, I find things interesting that other people don't find interesting. I'm more sensitive than some people. I think the problem is actually me. I remember being 7 years old. It was the first time I had finally developed the confidence to be myself. I had hit my internalized misogyny tomboy phase, and I remember I had like a gang of little girls. I was the ringleader because I've always been confident, I've always been assertive, I've always been authoritarian. And we had some really weird rules that I made up. Like one rule was, whenever we have to line up for class, we always have to be last in line. All of us have to be last in line. Because I was so competitive that I would get extremely upset if I was not first. And since a lot of kids like being first, I realized, okay, there's less competition to be last in line, so I'm going to like turn being last in time into the new being first in line. But if any of my friends want to be first in line, if any of them want to be before me in line, then I'm gonna freak out. So therefore, no one can be first, everyone has to be last. And that was one of the rules. Another rule was I outlawed the word gross. No one in my friend group was allowed to consider things gross, because I knew that a lot of things I liked talking about and liked doing were considered gross, and I didn't want to feel embarrassed or self-conscious around my friends, so I basically just policed their freedom of speech so that they could not insult me or make fun of me.
Oh, wow! I feel good. Da-na-na-na-na-na.
So I was about 10 years old when I watched When Carl Met George for the first time, and I could connect to Carl in some ways. I remembered, like, when I was in 5th grade, there was a science teacher who freaked me out. She was disturbing. I hated the way she sounded. I hated the way she talked. I hated the way her face looked. It looked like a vampire's. Carl's reaction to something that his friend George showed him was very similar to how I felt, at least, about my science teacher. I never, like, had a panic attack the way he did. Although I did have panic attacks about other things that were very similar to actually Carl's panic attacks.
To recapitulate,
My first impression of Asperger's syndrome was like, I can relate to it a little bit, but not to the point where I actually think I have it. As I began watching more YouTube videos, I remember looking up the condition Kabuki syndrome. I got a video about this girl who looked completely normal, but her younger sister was the one with Kabuki syndrome. Actually, her story was that she had Asperger's syndrome. Her name is Rosie. And as I was watching this video of this girl who was 13, I was 13, and I completely related to her. All these things she was talking about was like getting overstimulated through different things around her, obsessive interests, being like, you know, able to function socially, but being socially awkward and having a hard time connecting with people, unable to do eye contact, and repeating phrases when you're at a loss for words yourself. I 100% related to this. I took several online tests. All of them said autism very likely. Then I tried to convince my mom to get me diagnosed. I remember actually, I went to the podiatrist for my yearly checkup, and I asked her if I could get like an autism diagnosis, and she looked at me and she went like this. She leaned in my face, tried to force eye contact with me, and was like, "Why do you think you have autism, sweetie?" I was a bit freaked out because she was too close to me and forcing eye contact. So my mind blanked, and the first thing that came to my head was like,
Because I have a hard time making eye contact.
which was so stupid and cringy at the time, but I literally didn't know what else to say.
you don't do that to autistic people. You don't.
My mother signs me up for a psychiatrist appointment. It's a 1.5 year long waiting list. That's several $1,000s. And then she's like, "Do you really need a label?" And I'm thinking like, I don't need a label. Like, I've never needed an aid in my life, but I have this social disability that makes it hard for me to connect with people, and I would appreciate the community of the label. I would appreciate knowing that this is what's wrong with me. I don't have all these different issues because I'm bad at being normal. This perfectly explains why I am the way I am. But long story short, she gave up on searching for a diagnosis. About 1.5 years ago, I watched a video by another autistic person talking about who Hans Asperger was. What I learned from her and from different people on TikTok was that Hans Asperger was a Nazi. He used the term Asperger syndrome to separate the smart autistics from the dumb autistics. The dumb autistics could go die in concentration camps, and the smart autistics could be put to work at labor camps. Now, when I did my own research,
And granted, I read articles about him.
Hans Asperger was a psychiatrist.
He wasn't a Nazi.
He was definitely a Nazi sympathizer. I think most people were in Germany during World War II. What he wanted to do was start a school for people with Asperger's syndrome, not put them to work. I mean, maybe he did, but what I read was that he just wanted to build a school for them. However, he was in fact complicit with sending autistic people off to be euthanized so that their blood could be used for German soldiers during World War II.
And that is heinous, and that I would hold him accountable to.
I completely sympathize with the idea to scrap the term Asperger. Autism spectrum disorder as a whole is a social disability. You have a hard time connecting with other people. You have a hard time picking up on social cues. The difference between autism and Asperger's syndrome is most people with autism have an intellectual disability as well. They're slower learners, and I don't say that as in an ableistic way because people learn at different rates, but generally speaking, they're often a bit delayed when it comes to learning, and that's okay. A lot of people with Asperger's syndrome are actually faster learners than average. I think there should be a distinction because the experiences of somebody who has classic autism versus Asperger's syndrome are somewhat similar, but actually pretty different. A lot of people with autism have an intellectual disability and maybe even physical disorders such as gluten intolerance, lactose intolerance, so it's easier to diagnose autism earlier in life than Asperger's syndrome. Therefore, people with autism can get the help they need from an early age.
Okay, I forgot to mention ABA therapy, which is Applied Behavioral Analysis Therapy, which is basically conversion therapy for autistic people. It forces them to act contrary to their nature and to act normal to the point where it becomes uncomfortable and they lose themselves. Getting diagnosed early is not always fun and games. It often means that autistic people will be forced into this ABA therapy program. But again, this is another example of how people diagnosed with classic autism early will have a different experience from people diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
A lot of people with Asperger's syndrome, though, find out about their diagnosis themselves.
When I was 8 years old, I got diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome by myself.
So they spend their entire childhood, most of their childhood, maybe even most of their life, thinking that they're just bad at being human. And then they finally come to the conclusion, wait, I'm not bad at being normal. There's something different in my brain that makes me unable to connect to other people. That experience of people expecting you to behave normally because you can kind of function in society normally makes your childhood, teenage years, and adulthood a lot harder. I want to acknowledge that living with autism is a lot harder than living with Asperger's syndrome because you are more sensitive. You do have a harder time connecting to other people than people with Asperger's syndrome can.
I get a little bit annoyed when I hear people on TikTok who could probably be diagnosed with high-functioning autism complain about how hard it is and how I need a lot more help than you can see and I get a lot less help than I need. When you can communicate pretty normally, you can actually talk to people. A lot of people with classic autism are nonverbal. Often the demands of people with high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome will be some level of entitlement where they feel that other people need to accept their rudeness. Like, having autism doesn't mean you're allowed to be rude. Having autism does mean you lack some social awareness, but lacking social awareness is not an excuse for not trying hard enough to show respect to other people. We all have to work hard to respect people in this world, and just because you have autism doesn't mean you should not be expected some level of decency around other people.
I have a friend with autism who was my friend since 5th grade, and I can relate to him on different things of how I see the world, but his experience with being diagnosed with autism from an early age and having an aide throughout elementary school is completely different from mine. He also gets extra time on tests and extra time for homework that I don't get, and frankly, I don't really need, but I still experience the same social disability.
Some of you in the Discord might remember some micro meltdowns I've had over various things.
Something I would appreciate is for people to be writing more books for people with Asperger's syndrome so that we can learn how to interact with other people. When I was 12 or 13, I read this book called How to Be Human. You know, it was a joking title, but it was for kids with Asperger's syndrome to learn how to connect to other people in society.
And I remember barely any of it.
But one grain of salt I will take away for the rest of my life. When you want to point out something that someone has done, you don't start with, you did this, because that is accusatory. What you should be saying is like, I feel XYZ when you do this. You start with I, and then they're less emotionally charged. And that was invaluable advice that I'm glad I didn't have to work through for my entire life through trial and error.
So when I learned that Asperger's was now taboo to use, I was like,
Okay, yeah, I'm okay just using autism.
but when I told people that I was autistic, they wouldn't believe me, and they were confused because they were used to classic autism. But when I explained what Asperger syndrome was, it made a lot more sense. In conclusion, it is valuable to have a distinct label. Just because there's a difference between classic autism and Asperger syndrome doesn't mean that one group is better than the other. And while Hans Asperger does not need to be honored by his name being used, I think we do need a new term for the experience of being an Aspie.